Before we begin, if you have ever felt a strong inner pull towards something and had absolutely no idea whether to trust it, if you have ever been paralyzed by the question of whether what you were hearing was divine guidance, your own fear, or simply the noise of an anxious mind, if you have ever made a major life decision and wondered, afterward, whether you listened to the right voice, this conversation is going to give you something you have been looking for a long time. And nobody takes your inner life seriously enough to ask the hard questions. Subscribe right now. Because what we are about to explore sits at the crossroads of psychology, spirituality, and the most intimate question a human being can ask. When something speaks from inside me, what is it? And should I listen? Let's go. There is a moment most of us know intimately. You are standing at a threshold. A decision to be made, a direction to choose, a relationship to enter or leave, a door that is either opening or closing, and you cannot quite tell which. And from somewhere inside you, a voice speaks. Or not a voice, exactly more like a pressure, a knowing. A feeling in the body that carries a quality of certainty your rational mind has not yet caught up to. And immediately, sometimes within the same breath, another voice arrives. And this one asks the question that unravels everything. But how do you know? How do you know it is not just fear dressed up as wisdom? How do you know it is not wishful thinking wearing the costume of divine guidance? How do you know the certainty you feel is not simply the anxiety you have been carrying for so long that it has started to feel like the truth? How do you know whether you are hearing your intuition, your anxiety, or God? This is not a small question. It is, for many people, one of the most practically urgent questions of their inner life. And it is one that most spiritual traditions address with beautiful language and frustratingly little precision. And it is one that most psychological frameworks address with clinical accuracy and frustratingly little room for the sacred. Carl Jung, who spent his entire career living at the exact intersection of those two worlds, gave us something better than either. He gave us a map. Let us begin with the three voices themselves. Because before we can learn to distinguish them, we have to understand what each of them actually is, where it comes from, what it is made of, and what it is trying to do. The first voice is anxiety. In Jungian terms, anxiety is primarily a product of the shadow, the unconscious accumulation of everything we have suppressed, denied, or refused to integrate about ourselves. Our unprocessed fear, our unacknowledged wounds, our unresolved grief, our early experiences of danger, abandonment, rejection, or powerlessness that never fully healed but went underground and now surface reliably. Whenever the present moment carries any resemblance to those original conditions, anxiety is not irrational. It is not a malfunction. It is the psyche's alarm system originally designed to protect a much younger, much more vulnerable version of you from real threats that existed in a specific past context. The problem is that the alarm system was calibrated in childhood and was never updated. It fires for threats that no longer exist with the same intensity it fired for threats that were genuinely life-altering. And anxiety is extraordinarily intelligent. It does not always announce itself as fear. It disguises itself. It speaks in the language of practicality, of caution, of responsibility, of wisdom. It says things like, "This is not the right time." It says you are not ready. It says, "What if you fail? What if you are abandoned? What if you choose wrong and cannot recover?" And because these warnings are often dressed in the vocabulary of prudence, they can be genuinely difficult to distinguish from legitimate discernment. Jung would say, anxiety speaks from the past. It is always, at its root, a message from a previous version of yourself, responding to a previous version of danger, and its primary agenda always, without exception, is not growth. it is safe. The preservation of the known, the avoidance of the unfamiliar, the maintenance of the conditions that the wounded inner self associates with survival. When anxiety speaks, it is always trying to keep you small enough to be safe. The second voice is intuition. And this is where Jung becomes genuinely extraordinary, because his understanding of intuition is far more sophisticated than the popular notion of a vague gut feeling or feminine mysticism. Jung identified intuition as one of the four primary psychological functions alongside thinking, feeling, and sensation. It was not, for him, a supernatural phenomenon or a mysterious gift available only to the specially attuned. It was a cognitive process, a legitimate, powerful, and often undervalued way of perceiving and processing reality. Specifically, intuition is the psyche's capacity to perceive wholes rather than parts, to register patterns, connections, and meanings that the analytical mind, which works sequentially, linearly, one piece at a time, has not yet assembled. Intuition draws on the vast reservoir of the unconscious, on everything the psyche has observed, experienced, and absorbed, including much that never entered conscious awareness, and synthesizes it into a perception that arrives not as an argument, but as a knowing. This is why intuition is so often experienced as sudden, as coming from nowhere, as arriving fully formed rather than being constructed step by step. It is not coming from nowhere, it is coming from the depths of the unconscious, which has been processing information that the conscious mind was not tracking. And when the synthesis is complete, it surfaces as an image, as a physical sensation, as a quiet but unmistakable certainty. Jung would say, intuition speaks from the present. It is a perception of what is actually happening in a situation, in a relationship, in the interior right now. Not colored by past wounds, not distorted by future fears, but grounded in an accurate, whole-system reading of the current reality. And its primary agenda is not safety. It is not comfort. It is not the preservation of the known. Its primary agenda is truth. The third voice is the most difficult to speak about with precision, because it is the one that most resists psychological categorization without being diminished by it. Jung called it the self, capital S. The totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, integrated and still integrating. The organizing center of the entire interior life. The deepest layer of who you are, deeper than the ego, deeper than the persona, deeper than the wound, deeper than the accumulated history of everything that has shaped you. And Jung, who was a scientist, who was rigorously empirical, who spent his career trying to map the psyche with as much precision as possible, Jung said something about the self that he could not say more cautiously without being dishonest. He said the self was, functionally, indistinguishable from what the world's great religious traditions have always meant by the word God, not identical, not a reduction of the divine to psychology, but functionally indistinguishable in the sense that the voice of the self, when it speaks, carries the same qualities that mystics across every tradition have always attributed to divine guidance. It is not loud, it does not argue, it does not threaten. It does not flatter. It does not tell you what you want to hear. It tells you what is true, what is needed, what is yours to do. And it speaks with a quality of authority that is unlike anything the ego produces, not the authority of certainty, not the authority of force, but the authority of depth, of something that knows you from the inside out, that has been present longer than your conscious memory, that is pointing not toward what is comfortable, but toward what is whole. Jung called this the Vox Dei, the voice of God, and he believed it was available to every human being, not as a supernatural intervention from outside, but as the deepest interior movement of the psyche itself, the self reaching toward consciousness, trying to bring what is unconscious into the light, trying to pull the whole person in the direction of their fullest, most integrated, most genuinely alive existence. So now the practical question: how do you tell them apart? Jung did not offer a simple formula. He was too honest for that. But he did identify specific qualities by which each voice tends to operate. And these qualities, once understood, become genuinely useful diagnostic tools. The first quality to examine is direction. Where is the voice pointing you? Anxiety points backward toward familiar patterns, toward avoidance, toward the contraction of possibility. Even when it uses future language, what if this goes wrong? It is always pulling you back toward the known, toward the past, toward safety. Intuition points laterally. It gives you an accurate reading of the present landscape. It says, this is what is actually here. This is what this situation actually is, regardless of what you want it to be or fear it might be. It is a perception, not a directive. The voice of the self points forward, and more specifically, it points inward and forward simultaneously. It moves you toward greater wholeness, greater authenticity, greater alignment with who you most deeply are. And importantly, it often points toward precisely the thing that the ego would not have chosen, the path that is more demanding, more exposing, more genuinely alive than the comfortable alternative. The second quality is tone. Anxiety is urgent. It creates pressure. It insists on immediate resolution. It cannot tolerate waiting, sitting with uncertainty, allowing the question to remain open. It needs an answer, any answer, because the uncertainty itself is unbearable to a psyche organized around threat detection. Intuition is calm. Even when it delivers uncomfortable information, this relationship is not what you are telling yourself it is. This path is not yours. It delivers it without drama, without the frantic edge of anxiety. It states, and it waits. It does not repeat itself endlessly. It speaks, and then it is quiet. And the voice of the self is quieter still. It is the stillness beneath the noise. The thing that remains when the anxiety has exhausted itself, and the intuition has delivered its perception, and all the conscious deliberation has run its course. It is what is left when everything else has spoken. And it is the thing that was there first before the anxiety arrived, before the intuition surfaced a ground-level orientation that does not argue because it does not need to. The third quality, and this is the one Jung considered most diagnostically reliable, is what the voice asks of you. Anxiety asks you to contract, to protect, to defend, to make yourself smaller or safer or more defended than you currently are. Intuition asks you to see clearly, to stop telling yourself a convenient story and look at what is actually present. The voice of the self, the deepest voice, the one Jung associated with the divine, asks you to become, to grow, to integrate, to do the harder, truer, more genuinely alive thing, to choose wholeness over comfort, authenticity over approval, the real self over the performed one. And here is the test that Jung would apply above all others. Does this voice make you more yourself or less? Anxiety makes you less yourself. It diminishes you. It keeps you performing, hiding, avoiding, and contracting. The voice that genuine intuition and the self both share in different registers, at different depths, is a voice that, when followed, returns you to yourself. That makes you feel, even when the path is difficult, even when it costs something real, more alive, more true, more here. Now, I want to address something that makes this question especially complicated for spiritually oriented people. Because there is a particular way that anxiety disguises itself inside a spiritual framework that is almost uniquely difficult to detect, it borrows the language of God. It says, I feel cold, when what it means is I am afraid of being ordinary. It says I have peace about this, when what it means is I have finally stopped fighting my fear enough to feel numb. It says God told me that what it means is my need for certainty is so overwhelming that I have outsourced the decision to an authority I cannot be held accountable for doubting. Jung would not say this to shame anyone. He would say it because he understood, clinically and spiritually, that the psyche is extraordinarily creative in its self-deception, and that spiritual language, precisely because it carries the authority of the divine, is one of the most effective disguises the anxious ego has ever found. The discernment practice he would recommend is not a formula. It is an ongoing relationship with your own interior, a commitment to knowing yourself, your wounds, your patterns, your shadow, your history well enough that when a voice speaks, you can recognize its fingerprints. You can ask, have I heard this voice before? What did it cost me to follow it? What did it cost me to ignore it? Does it carry the quality of my fear or the quality of my depth? This is the work of individuation, and it is never finished. But it becomes, with practice, more reliable. The voices become more distinguishable. The signal becomes clearer. Not because the noise disappears, but because you learn to know yourself well enough to navigate it. The question is whether it is intuition, anxiety, or God that may never be answered with perfect certainty. Jung would not promise you that. The interior life is too complex, too layered, too alive for that kind of clean resolution. But here is what he would promise. The more you know yourself, your shadow, your wounds, your genuine depths, your real self, the less leverage anxiety has over your discernment. The more you practice sitting in the stillness beneath the noise, the more you develop an ear for the voice that is actually worth following. Not the loudest voice, not the most urgent voice, not the voice that promises safety or certainty or the approval of everyone watching. The quietest voice, the deepest one, the one who has been patient through every season of your confusion, the one that does not flatter you or frighten you but simply, consistently, unmistakably points you home. That voice is real. Jung spent his entire life testifying to its reality and learning to hear it, learning to distinguish it from the noise of your fear and the signal of your genuine perception is not a luxury. It is the central spiritual and psychological work of a human life. And it begins, as all the most important things begin, with the willingness to be still enough to listen. If this gave you language for something you have been living but could not name, if it handed you a tool you have genuinely needed, then you understand what nobody and empire of the mind is here to do. Subscribe to this channel. Join a community of people who are serious about knowing themselves not for the sake of self-absorption, but because self-knowledge is the foundation of every good thing. Every relationship, every decision, every act of genuine courage begins inside. Subscribe right now. Share this with someone who is standing at a threshold right now and needs help telling the voices apart because someone in your life is listening to anxiety and calling it God. And this might be the thing that changes how they hear themselves. Subscribe, and let's keep building the interior life that everything else depends on. The empire we are building is not built on the loudest voice. It is built on the discipline and the grace of learning to hear the deepest one. Subscribe, and we will keep listening together.